The wedding wasn't loud, it wasn't public, and it wasn't breaking any rules. But that didn't stop the HOA president from trying to shut it down. Days before the ceremony, she declared our backyard wedding unauthorized. She warned us it violated community standards. She threatened fines, security removal, and even police involvement if we didn't cancel. Family had already booked flights. Vendors were paid. The date couldn't move. What she didn't know was that we had already gone through the city. We had a permit, written approval, everything signed and filed. And the moment she tried to exercise authority she didn't actually have, she turned a private celebration into a public showdown she wasn't prepared for. Because when the city stepped in, her power vanished instantly. The wedding was supposed to be simple. No big venue, no ballroom, just close family, a few friends, and the backyard of the home we already loved. It was personal, meaningful, the kind of celebration that felt right to us instead of staged for everyone else. The backyard was perfect for it. It was private, fenced, and spacious enough to accommodate a small ceremony without disturbing anyone. No amplified music, no street parking issues, no open invitation to the public. Just a quiet afternoon wedding followed by dinner and conversation. Before we committed to anything, we did our homework. We checked city regulations for private events. We contacted the local permitting office. We explained exactly what we were planning: guest count, hours, layout, noise expectations. The city told us a temporary event permit was required, and we applied immediately. The permit was approved. It was clear, specific, dated, and valid for the exact day of the wedding. With that in place, we moved forward. Vendors were booked, chairs were reserved, a small canopy was rented. Family members began making travel arrangements. Everything was aligned around a date that meant something to us. The HOA hadn't been part of the conversation. Up until then, there'd been no indication it needed to be. The rules didn't prohibit private gatherings. There were general guidelines about noise and parking, but nothing remotely suggesting that a wedding, especially one fully permitted by the city, would be an issue. That changed about 2 weeks before the ceremony. An email arrived from the HOA president with our address in the subject line. She said she'd been informed that a large event was being planned at the property. She said backyard weddings were not allowed under HOA standards. She warned that hosting one would be considered a violation and could result in fines or forced cancellation. There was no mention of permits, no questions asked, just a declaration. I replied calmly. I explained it was a private wedding. I told her it was permitted by the city. I attached the permit. I clarified the guest count and reassured her that everything would comply with noise and parking rules. Her response came quickly. She said the HOA didn't allow weddings. She said the permit didn't matter. She said community standards took precedence and that enforcement would occur if we proceeded. That was the moment the situation stopped feeling like a misunderstanding. She wasn't looking for clarification. She was asserting authority. And with the wedding date getting closer, the pressure was about to escalate in ways we didn't expect. At first, we tried to stay calm. Weddings are stressful enough without adding a power struggle into the mix. And we didn't want conflict to overshadow what was supposed to be a joyful moment. So we responded carefully. We restated the facts. We reattached the permit. We explained again that the event was private, permitted, and fully compliant with city regulations. Her response didn't soften. Instead, it became more formal. She warned that the HOA would be monitoring the property on the day of the event. She said security could be called if the gathering exceeded what she considered acceptable. She mentioned fines for violations of community standards and suggested we reconsider our plans for the good of the neighborhood. The tone was no longer informational, it was threatening. As the wedding approached, the pressure started spreading outward. Neighbors mentioned that the HOA president had been asking questions. One said she'd been warned about traffic issues. Another said the board was concerned about noise complaints that hadn't actually happened yet. None of this was based on anything real. It was all hypothetical, assumptions, worst-case scenarios being treated as certainty. We started getting nervous emails from family members. They'd heard rumors that the wedding might be shut down. Vendors asked whether everything was still confirmed. Some wanted reassurance that they wouldn't be turned away or fined for being there. Every conversation that should have been about celebration became about damage control. I contacted the HOA management company directly. I forwarded the permit and asked them to clarify whether the HOA had any authority to cancel a city-approved private event. They were vague. They said the board president handled enforcement. They suggested that if the HOA believed the event violated standards, it could take action regardless of city approval. That answer didn't sit right. So I went back to the city. I explained the situation in detail. I forwarded the HOA's emails. I asked whether a private wedding with a valid permit could be shut down by an HOA. The city's response was firm. They said the permit authorized the event. They said the HOA could enforce its own rules, but it could not override city approval or interfere with a lawful, permitted gathering unless there was a clear safety issue. They offered to put that in writing. That's when everything changed. I informed the HOA president that the city had confirmed the permit's validity and that they were prepared to issue a formal clarification letter if needed. Her reply came almost instantly. She said the city didn't understand HOA authority. She said permits didn't supersede community standards. She warned that if we proceeded, the HOA would take action during the event itself. At that point, the wedding was only days away. Flights were booked. Family was already arriving. The stress was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. We found ourselves preparing for a celebration while also bracing for confrontation. We asked the city for the letter, not an email, not a verbal assurance, something official, something stamped, something that couldn't be dismissed or reinterpreted. Because if the HOA president planned to show up on our wedding day with enforcement threats, we wanted absolute clarity about who actually had the authority to decide what happened next. And when that letter arrived, it would determine whether our wedding went forward in peace or turned into a public standoff she wasn't prepared for. The letter from the city arrived the morning before the wedding. It wasn't vague, it wasn't polite, it was direct, official, and impossible to ignore. It confirmed that the temporary event permit authorized a private wedding on the property. It stated that the gathering complied with all municipal regulations, including noise, safety, and occupancy limits. And most importantly, it clarified that no homeowners association had the authority to cancel, shut down, or interfere with a permitted private event unless there was an immediate safety emergency. There wasn't. I forwarded the letter to the HOA president. This time, there was no reply, no warning, no threats, no claims about community standards. The silence lasted all day. The next morning, the wedding day arrived. Family was already there. Chairs were set up. Flowers were being arranged. Everything we planned was finally taking shape. And despite the tension of the previous weeks, the atmosphere felt calm, hopeful even. Then just as guests began arriving, a familiar car pulled up. The HOA president stepped out. She walked toward the backyard with the same confidence she'd shown in every email. She said the HOA had received complaints. She said the gathering needed to stop. She warned that enforcement would follow if we didn't comply. Before anyone could respond, I handed her the city's letter. She skimmed it once, then again. Her posture changed. The confidence drained from her expression as she reached the final paragraph, the one that made it clear that interfering with a permitted event could expose the HOA to legal consequences. She didn't argue. She didn't threaten fines. She didn't say anything at all. She turned around, walked back to her car, and left. No police arrived. No enforcement followed. No interruptions came. The ceremony began on time. Family watched. Friends smiled. The moment unfolded exactly as it was meant to, without interference, without fear, without someone else trying to control it. And just like that, weeks of pressure ended in seconds. Not because we raised our voices, not because we backed down, but because real authority showed up and false authority stepped aside. After the wedding, the neighborhood felt different, not louder, not divided, just quieter in a way that comes from tension finally being released. The HOA didn't send another email about the event. There were no fines, no follow-up warnings, no attempt to reframe what had happened. It was as if the entire situation had never existed. A few days later, a brief message went out to the community. It reminded residents about event guidelines and encouraged anyone planning gatherings to follow city regulations. The wording was careful and vague. There was no mention of weddings, permits, or enforcement, but everyone understood what it meant. Neighbors who had watched the situation unfold started reaching out. Some congratulated us. Others admitted they'd been worried the wedding would be shut down. A few said they hadn't realized the HOA's authority had limits until they saw what happened. The conversation shifted. People began asking questions they'd never asked before, about permits, about what the HOA could actually enforce, about whether community standards were rules or just opinions dressed up as authority. As for the HOA president, her approach changed noticeably. She stopped making unilateral decisions. Enforcement notices slowed down across the board. Messages that once sounded confident and threatening became cautious and procedural. Legal language replaced assumptions. She didn't apologize, but she didn't push again either. The wedding itself became what it was always meant to be, a memory rooted in joy instead of conflict. The stress faded. What remained was the reminder that standing your ground doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it just requires preparation. Permits matter, documentation matters, and authority only exists where the law allows it. The experience reinforced something important, not just for us, but for the entire community. HOAs have a role. They can help maintain shared spaces and set reasonable guidelines. But they aren't governments. They don't get to rewrite city law. And they don't get to decide what people can celebrate on their own property simply because they feel uncomfortable. In the end, the wedding wasn't shut down. What ended was the illusion of unchecked power. And once that illusion was gone, everything else fell back into place, exactly where it belonged.